Well, I guess the cat's out of the bag. What you don't know is I was actually plagiarizing from sermons from your keynote speaker tonight, Scott Sauls. I'm sorry, Scott. 19 years of ministry in the church in Mechanicsburg, PA. I met with my elders. They brought the evidence before me. And I began to realize that plagiarism is a very serious offense for a pastor. I was confronted. Eventually, I would be deposed. And to be honest with you, I really don't want to be talking about this with you this evening. Because there is a whole lot of shame that accompanies plagiarism. I had broken the trust that I had been entrusted with. That was to lead and to teach God's people by the preaching of His word. And I ended up deceiving people that I had poured out my life to for nearly 2 decades. It doesn't really make sense. I didn't intend to deceive with God's word. I didn't even really intend to build up my own reputation, but I was hiding a much deeper reality. And that was, it was spiritual exhaustion. And how did it happen? Well, for one thing, I let it happen. I allowed it to happen. There really are no excuses. But plagiarism, like any other sin, is really the symptom of a much deeper reality. There was a growing disparity between what I was preaching and what I was spiritually experiencing in my own relationship with God. I was living in a world of spiritual unreality. Teresa of Avila once wrote in The Way of Perfection that almost all problems in the spiritual life stem from a lack of self-knowledge. And she couldn't be more right on. There was a gap growing between the worlds of my life, the world of what I was experiencing existentially in my relationship with God and what I was telling other people that I was experiencing in my relationship with God. And the fatigue was growing, but I didn't want to tell anyone. And why didn't I want to tell anyone? Because I loved being a pastor. There was no greater joy than for me to see my congregation grow and to be loved and freed by the gospel. But there was that growing disparity between what I was experiencing with God, and really, I was beginning to lose myself. Augustine once asked this question in his Confessions: how can you draw close to God when you are far from your own self? He asked that question with rhetorical force. And so what happened is that I just hit the wall. And please understand that my explanation here is not to justify myself in any way, but really to help you begin to understand some of the pressures many pastors face. Over the last 5 years of my calling, my second oldest son was diagnosed with the mental illness of severe bipolarism. He attempted to take his life. I'm sorry. 5 times over the span of 6 years. The nightmares of mental illness are unimaginable until you experience them. Some of you in this room know what I'm talking about. It's a storm that never abates. It never gives notice. And speaking as a father who deeply loves all 4 of his children, this broke me. It broke my wife. It almost destroyed my marriage. On top of it, we had gone through a split years earlier in our church, and letters, mean letters, anonymous letters had been written to my wife. So my wife and I had learned that it was not safe to share our personal struggles within the congregation. It just wasn't safe. And then on top of it, it was just the demand of ministry. And when COVID hit, oh my goodness, it just exponentially exploded. And so I had hit a wall. I felt like I was on a train that I desperately needed to jump off, but that train was going so fast I couldn't. And for the first time in my life, I woke up in the morning and I was afraid. Walls are daunting things. They can take the form of devastating news, disturbing diagnoses, debilitating circumstances, or simply God shielding his presence away from you in darkness. That was what St. John of the Cross talked about when he coined the dark night of the soul. But essentially, a wall is when we discover for the first time that our faith doesn't appear to work. That's how I walked into Serving Leaders. I wanted to quit. I wanted to quit God. I wanted to quit the church. And I'm pretty sure my wife wanted to quit me. I didn't have very high expectations when I met with Dave. I thought, I'm going to get something clinical, technical, impersonable. I thought all I'm going to get is I'm going to get reinforced in the isolation that I was already experiencing. But what I received was the gospel. I could see that Dave cared. He cared about damaged and demoralized people, plagiarizing pastors like me. And he met me in my ministry, and he extended to me anew God's mercy. And he provided counseling for me and my wife so that we could start to connect again. See, Servant Leaders doesn't just serve pastors or ministry leaders. They serve the spouses and the children of ministry leaders. And that's an invaluable blessing, knowing the nature of ministry. And Dave taught me that by God's direction, going through the wall can actually pull me out of the darkness back into the light. But it took a demand, and that demand was for me to die to self. And that demand is there because it is the only thing that stands in between our ability to move into the reality and experience the fact that God is our one true delight. And what I learned is that walls in life are actually vehicles that God implements to drive us to discover that he delights in us. I just want to thank Dave. I want to thank all of the Serving Leaders staff for really the vision that they have to serve those who serve along with their families. And my only regret, as we heard earlier on that video, is that I wish I would have come to Dave earlier for that preventative care instead of having to have Dave do that triage on me in my life. But I just want to let you know that this ministry is a lifeline. And I hope that you will join with Serving Leaders, because they are focused on serving those who serve. Thank you for letting me share.